Okay, hey folks, today we're going to be looking at government and law in ancient Egypt and continuing on with our discussion of continuity and stability in ancient Egyptian society for 3,000 years. We're going to look at how the political and legal structures of ancient Egypt were shaped by religious beliefs, because religion has so much to do with why and how ancient Egypt managed to maintain a stable, continuous society for that time period. So first and foremost, what I'd like you to do is try and put these 8 social classes in order. So simply pause the video and make a guess as to how these 8 might fall in order in ancient Egypt. And then unpause the video and come back and we'll chat about it. So the actual social pyramid, as you might have guessed, at the top sits the pharaoh, obviously, and then second in sort of line in terms of social status were the priests. Knowing what you know about, ancient Egyptian society and culture, that's probably not very surprising that the religious folk are second in the social order. Certainly they were very highly regarded, and we'll today be looking at how the pharaoh plays into that whole idea of religion and why religion and how religion was so important to him and his rule. Interestingly, the military was third, which when we did this in my class was a surprise to most people because Egypt doesn't really have a strong professional army ever. In the New Kingdom, certainly that's the only time that they're concerned with expansion and trying to maintain a strong empire. In the Old and the Middle Kingdom, as you guys probably looked at when you were looking at the eras last week, really those things are not of a concern. Yet still, when you are in the military, you are considered to be of a very high social status. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Most of the people in my class thought that the fourth class of scribes actually would have been ahead of the military. But yes, scribes come next. Definitely very, very important. Most of the government officials in ancient Egypt were scribes as well. And just like in Mesopotamia, important for record keeping, tax collecting, all of those things. Next in line were actually the merchants, and again in my class they thought maybe the artisans would have been next, but it's actually the merchants who are next, and that maybe is reflective of how important trade would have been in terms of, in ancient Egypt you only have so many resources. They need lumber from other places, they need gold from other places, so merchants were very important. Artisans then are next, so architectural works, jewelry makers, all of those kinds of things, which yes, play such a huge role, at least in our idea of what Egypt is and of Egyptian legacy. Very important for us, very important for them as well, but not considered one of those high social classes, interestingly. And then, of course, you have farmers right above slaves, who are the last ones. And we'll talk about slaves a little bit more when we look at the pyramids and that whole myth about slaves building the pyramids, which they did not. But we'll certainly look at slaves a little bit more then. Farmers, though, farmers are so important, and yet they, as always in all civilizations, fall towards the bottom of the social ladder. Even when you think about farmers in our society today, certainly farming is so crucial to survival, and yet they are at the bottom of the social order. So some interesting kind of things there in terms of the social pyramid of Egypt, and today we'll be looking at together a few of the ones towards the top, and then you guys will look at the daily lives of some of the ones towards the bottom. So government and political structure in general in ancient Egypt, and this again is probably something you looked at when you were looking at the eras of ancient Egyptian society. They had a very highly centralized state very early on. So from the Old Kingdom into the Middle and the New Kingdoms, very few rebellions, very few upheavals, a very highly centralized state. And they begin this in the Old Kingdom and it continues through, virtually unchanged throughout that 3,000 years. And again, that's kind of our major question. How were they able to be so stable and create this continuous unchanged society for 3,000 years? And everything we look at in this unit will kind of be pieces of answering that question. So part of the king and the pharaoh himself was that he owned all the land, all the people, and the possessions. So he was very crucial to the whole structure and running of ancient Egypt. Below him then there was a hierarchy of government officials, tax collectors, law enforcers, all of those kinds of things. But certainly he was the most important in terms of the land and the law in ancient Egypt. Another kind of side note, this is something hopefully that you looked at when you were looking at the eras, is the idea that actually, even though we will for the most part use the term pharaoh because it sounds more Egyptian, it sounds much more interesting and cool, the term pharaoh actually was not used by Egyptians until the New Kingdom. They actually just used a term for king in the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. So even though we always think of Egyptian kings as being pharaohs, technically the term pharaoh wasn't until the New Kingdom, but we'll probably be using pharaoh and king simultaneously just because pharaoh is more recognizable as Egyptian and it sounds cooler. So the pharaoh, or the king's role himself, he was considered a god king in Egypt. So a couple interesting things about Egypt, and we'll look at the gods themselves a little bit more, but there was no contradiction whatsoever in Egyptian society. They thought all of these things work together and they all make sense together. So the king, whenever he was king on earth, was always considered to be the earthly embodiment of the god Horus, who we'll look at a little bit later. No matter who the king was, he was considered to be Horus. As soon as a king died, he then became Osiris in the underworld. So you can imagine Osiris sitting guarding and ruling over the underworld, then has the spirit within him, sort of all of the pharaohs and the kings who had died on earth. So always Horus in life, always Osiris in death. Because of that, the kings ruled by divine right. So the gods gave them the power to rule, and everything they did was because of the gods. The king was also able to mediate between the gods and the people of Egypt, which was very important. You didn't necessarily need a priest. The king could talk to the gods himself. Also, because the power of the king came from the gods, that was what was supposed to ensure stability. And also, that was a reason why there were very few rebellions in ancient Egypt. They just thought, if we've got a bad king, obviously we did something bad, and now the gods are trying to punish us or correct something. So they very, very rarely rebelled against a king while the king was alive, and we'll look at that when we look a little bit more at some of the specific pharaohs, because they thought whatever the king is doing is divinely inspired. That is the rule of whatever gods want to happen right now. Another really important thing about the pharaoh was that he had to rule according to Ma'at, and this was, again, the sort of goddess that we looked at before as being the symbol of balance and harmony in the universe. And upsetting that balance would mean destroying all harmony, all tradition, all order, all civilization in ancient Egypt. So all of the pharaohs, they didn't have like a book or a constitution that they had to go to when they became king, being like, all right, what am I supposed to do now? They just had to rule according to Ma'at. And simultaneously, the people of Egypt had to live their lives according to Ma'at. Kind of a side note, kingship was actually passed down from the oldest, to the oldest son of the principal queen. Very often kings had more than one queen. And so kingship was passed to the oldest son of the principal queen. And if not through her, then the secondary queen's oldest son. Just kind of as an interesting side note. Queens themselves were very powerful, very highly regarded. Their duty was to produce heirs, technically, but they could very often rule as a co-regent after their death, especially in the case of their son being, 6, 7, 8, too young to rule himself. Very often the queen became co-regent or co-ruler of Egypt. And you've got the case of several, and I'm not going to read through these here, but you can pause and read through them. Certainly we'll be looking at more of these queens when we look at some of the most influential pharaohs of Egypt. But you have the case very often, such as with Hatshepsut, where she becomes a very good, very powerful kind of pharaoh of the land because her stepson is too young at the time to rule. And so she presents herself as the ruler. She presents herself as masculine. And she is a very, very good pharaoh. And there is sort of scandal and whatnot connected to that we will look at when we look at her a little bit more. But it is very important to know that they did legitimately have some female rulers in Egypt through various different co-ruling situations. Under the king was the vizier. He was kind of like the prime minister to the king. He was usually a scribe. He got all of his orders from the king. He answered only to the king, and he was responsible for overseeing the entire administration of the government. So government officials would answer to the vizier. Very often they would not interact with the pharaoh or the king himself, but they would interact with the vizier and get their orders from him, who obviously got the orders from the king. He was also the head of the judiciary system, and he had very elaborate burial tombs. The vizier was obviously a very powerful, rich man, as is seen in his very rich burial tombs, oftentimes larger than some other lesser known or not as influential pharaohs. Viziers had very large, elaborate burial tombs. Same things with government officials. As I said before, government officials were mostly all scribes. They would record the deeds of the pharaohs, keep track of supplies and whatnot, keep track of tax collecting, justice management, public health, agriculture, trade, public works, all of those kinds of things. But very often they were scribes themselves. Very significant that they were the ones who often were recording, or responsible in part for recording, their deeds. They were also, as I said, rewarded very well for their efforts to the king. They had a lot of land. They were quite wealthy. Laws in ancient Egypt, since we've talked about this idea of judiciary system, interestingly, laws in Egypt, very unlike laws in Mesopotamia, where you have, the actual code of Hammurabi that you can look at and like read and see what law applies to me. In ancient Egypt, they had no codified bodies of law. There were no laws written down as like law number 18. There was none of that. They did have written records of the actual trials that took place, so they could see old laws that had been put in place by looking at the trial records, but there was no law book. There was nothing like that. Simply, as I said before, it was a matter of ruling by Ma'at, that system of truth, righteousness, justice, that was infused into the world at its creation, and your goal in life was to maintain that balance with Ma'at and to constantly seek harmony. So crime and punishments, because of that, were usually quite severe in ancient Egypt. They were used as more of a deterrent, and certainly they were not as fair as in Mesopotamia. There was no equality between like an eye for an eye. It was very extreme things, and you can see some of them here. Things like corruption, you would have your hands cut off. Rape of a freeborn woman, you would be castrated. So you can see where there is some correlation, but it's a very extreme punishment for the crime committed. In terms of execution options, in Mesopotamia, you looked at, the idea of being thrown into the river, and, is the monster going to eat you? Yes, no? Are you guilty? Are you innocent? In ancient Egypt, a very common one was being fed to the crocodiles in the Nile. So similar kind of water death there, but certainly crocodiles. How would you escape death by crocodile? No idea. Another really common one was suicide for people of high status. So they were encouraged to kill themselves if they had done something bad. And again, it goes back to that whole idea of disgrace, that disgracing the law of Ma'at and the order of the land was so bad that you should probably just kill yourself if that's what you did in your life. Some kind of interesting ones. For children who killed their parents, they had pieces of flesh cut away, they were placed on beds of thorns and burned alive. So not just killed, very specific kind of self-torture, and then execution, which, is, again, very extreme. Interesting that for parents who killed their child, the most extreme punishments, because all of these things we're talking about, very severe, the most extreme punishments the Egyptians could think of for parents who killed their children were to hold their dead child for 3 days and 3 nights. And that was it. And I think that says a lot about the ancient Egyptian psychology, that was the most extreme punishment that they could think of for a parent who had killed their children. So tells us a lot about the reverence that they had for children and the innocence that children had, and how you were supposed to revere children in your life. And that if you were, so terrible a person as to kill your child, you just had to sit with that for 3 days and 3 nights and think about your actions. And as you might imagine, many times parents would then kill themselves after that, again, falling to that suicide as their kind of execution option. Military deserters then would be publicly disgraced, and then you can imagine as well, sometimes that would result in them killing themselves as well because of that whole disgrace and going against Ma'at. So very interesting structures in ancient Egypt. What I'd like you to do now is take a look at what daily life was like for most Egyptians and complete the notes. Okay, bye.